Hey folks, wanted to do a review and summary of this book that I read just recently on a little vacation I had. It's called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. It was interesting to me because of my work, around the orientation around structures being explicit expectations, agreements, and rules. So I was very eager to kind of get my hands on it. Do a couple of bullet point summaries, I guess, here. So this book is looking specifically at how kind of cultures, national cultures, differ along a spectrum of what she calls tightness versus looseness. Tightness is like a certain kind of strict adherence to norms and rules. Looseness being more flexible and more permissive. So some examples of tight cultures were Singapore, Japan. They value order, security, and conformity. The rules are explicit, clear, and kind of widely enforced. The loose cultures, the examples that she highlights are the United States, Brazil, tend to emphasize freedom and creativity and a certain kind of tolerance for deviation. Rules are more relaxed. Again, this is her language or, my summary of kind of the points that she is making. She then connects this to some contextual factors, which I liked. The degree of tightness, she says, kind of reflects some historical threats, war, disease, natural disasters, and that those societies needed to kind of band together. Therefore, it had kind of have more alignment in the face of those threats. So there's more tightness. And then loose, again, US, Brazil, I forget the other ones that she mentioned, have less of that. Then she kind of does this thing where she tries to highlight kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each. So tightness, strong alignment to and adherence to norms and rules. Again, allows for a more efficient allocation of resources. They can kind of all pivot in one direction more quickly. But they're going to struggle with things like creativity and diversity. And then the loose cultures, more creative. More permissive. Interestingly, like happiness ratings weren't necessarily correlated with tightness or looseness. And the overall thesis of all of this is to say that thinking of tightness and looseness as constructs in this spectrum can kind of help us broadly, better understand and explain conflict, how, collaboration might work, leadership challenges, especially dealing with, kind of cross-cultural teams or issues. So that's the book. That's what she talks about. Now, excuse me, geez. That was kind of my summary. My quick review. I want to keep this short. That's kind of my review, at least from my perspective, like where my interests are. I get for like a general audience, broad strokes, having kind of tightness and looseness might help one make sense of some things. But specifically, some of the problems I had, she makes no differentiation between rules and norms, of which I think there is an important distinction to make. And, again, it might not be particularly relevant to her scope. I'll grant her that, but I do think there would have been ways to integrate making that distinction. In other words, a rule being the explicit form of the expectation, right? Something to be honored, to do or not do. And then the norm being, like the behavior, the actual, the actual behavior that as it shows up, whether it aligns with the rule or differs from the rule, right, is a separate issue. But the idea of the structure being importantly different from whether or not what the norm is, I think is a key factor. I also don't like that she kind of put tightness and looseness on a kind of a univariant spectrum, right? It's just kind of like it's here or here, because she does a lot with saying like, but a lot of countries are kind of somewhere in the middle, and in a lot of situations, even in tight countries with a tight culture, they're going to have places where they need more looseness, and even in loose cultures, they're going to have more places of tightness, which again is all to kind of say like, yeah, so how helpful is this broad kind of term that you're making, this spectrum of like here or there, when there's all these caveats now to say like just because you're dealing with someone from a tight culture doesn't necessarily mean that all of their behavior is going. Anyway, that just seems a bit confusing to me. I think it more accurate would have been to, really kind of like Constantine's 5 organizational paradigm model, in which her terminology of tight would kind of correspond to closed in that model. I can link some resources to this in the below the video, meaning kind of more hierarchical, more control over communication, decision making is more centralized, things like that. That tends, I think, to mean what she's trying to mean when she says tight. And then on the other end of that 5 paradigm model, the first 2, you have closed, and then you have random, which is kind of the opposite of that, which again kind of equates, I think, to what she's trying to say here about loose, which means there's a lot more autonomy, a lot less consistency. There's still, collaboration and that's happening, but it's of a different order. You could think of like a team of independent consultants, sometimes some software teams. Again, Constantine kind of developed this model out of some of David Cantor's work in family systems therapy. He was a software guy. So, there's a lot of examples of that. And then importantly, you can kind of integrate those two, not necessarily split the difference, right? We're not talking about like just somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. We're talking about taking some specific elements of the closed paradigm and some specific elements of the random paradigm and integrating them together in what Constantine would call the open paradigm, which I think like something like holacracy would kind of fit, where there is, alignment around certain kinds of structure, though there are, available pathways for people to contribute and define what those structures are. Again, we're talking now more about kind of teams, maybe organizations or companies, not societies. Again, I just think that's all a lot more accurate and more useful. I just kind of generally think that society as a unit of analysis is a pretty poor one. It doesn't really help you much to kind of just broadly label a whole culture of a society as a particular kind of way of being. Again, maybe just colloquially, or if you needed to, I suppose, we're going to have certain kind of assumptions or biases or preferences that are fine, but practically speaking, I don't think these are actually all that useful and may even kind of get in the way by closing down and collapsing your kind of assumptions and making them firmer than they were before. So that's kind of my summary and analysis of it. I've got a lot more to say. I made like, I don't know if anyone else does this, but I write in all my books. And in the back of this book, I made like this long list. Kind of hard to see. It's a little bit, the lighting is a little bit too bright in here. This long list of all the problems I had. It doesn't address explicitness and implicitness. Ignorant of the 5 paradigms, doesn't talk about David Hall's work with a low context, high context culture. That seems to me that could be perfectly relevant, at least called out. She makes some correlations that are either obvious in many cases, or again, they're just potential correlations and necessarily causations. And anyway, I'll stop there. If you're interested in this kind of topic and you're kind of a follower of my work, then I don't think you need to read this book. I do think this is more like, airport kind of bookstore kind of book for kind of a general audience, kind of popular psychology. Then maybe you would find it interesting. But for me, it just kind of creates, I think, a little bit more confusion than is necessary. And there are some better models out there than just this kind of broad, tight versus loose. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Any comments or questions, please post them down below. I'd be curious to hear if anyone else has read this book, what your thoughts are on it. And until next time, see you then. Bye.